What do the climate crisis and militarism have to do with each other? This presentation demonstrates that oil, war, and the climate crisis are all interconnected. We cannot save the planet without taking on the military. Oil-producing countries are more likely to have civil wars than other countries. 1/4 to 1/2 wars since 1973 have been fought over oil, in whole or in part. According to the 1980 Carter Doctrine, the U.S. will use military force to defend access to Persian Gulf oil. The U.S. has spent more than $8 trillion since the late 1970s protecting oil cargoes. We are still there, ready for war with Iran, despite the fact that we now have oil independence due to fracking. The Pentagon is the largest institutional user of oil in the world and thus contributor to the climate crisis by its use of oil. If the military were a country, the Department of Defense would rank 47th out of 197 countries for its greenhouse gas emissions. In conclusion, oil is indispensable for war. Wars are fought over oil. The Pentagon is the largest institutional user of oil, and oil is at the root of the climate crisis. Between 2003 and 2007, the U.S. war in Iraq released more greenhouse gas emissions annually than 139 countries. The estimated $3 trillion cost of the Iraq war was equivalent to all projected global investments in renewable energy by 2030. The U.S. is the largest institutional consumer of oil, estimated to be 5% of global use, and thus 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels. Yet this does not include fossil fuels used by the defense industry, nor hazardous waste cleanup on U.S. bases, and military industrial pollution, nor does it include rebuilding war-destroyed cities and infrastructure. The estimated greenhouse gas emissions from the entire world military then, and these are my estimates, are 15% from the use of fossil fuels. Given that the U.S. military budget is about 1/3 of the entire world military budget. General Joseph Votel, U.S. commander in the Middle East, described Raqqa, after we had continuously bombed it, as a pile of broken concrete and toxic rubble. He called for the world's help to rebuild the city. Countless concrete buildings in the Middle East have been destroyed in our wars there, including in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Greenhouse gas emissions from the production of concrete to rebuild these cities, but greenhouse gas production is estimated to be 8% of global emissions. If it were a country, cement production would be the 3rd largest emitter. Climate crises have the potential to add to conflict. For example, Syria suffered a 5-year drought from 2006 to 2011, which drove farmers to cities for survival. When unaided by the Syrian government, they joined the popular uprising in 2011, to which the government of Syria responded with armed force. 1/3 of crude oil from the Persian Gulf and Africa, and 1/2 of liquid natural gas, as well as large coal supplies from Australia and Indonesia, are transported through the South China Sea. These are vital energy sources for China, South Korea, Japan, and other regional countries. Obama's pivot to Asia in 2012 had an anti-China militaristic component by encouraging the reestablishment of U.S. military bases in Vietnam and the Philippines, and also by conducting war games with friends, Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, and Australia. The Biden administration is continuing this with the formation of the Quad alliance with India, Japan, and Australia, and war games with them. The Pentagon's mantra is that war with China is inevitable. China's economic threat has been transmuted to a military threat. China, in turn, is increasing its modern military capacity, building military bases on contested islands in the South China Sea, increasing its military budget, and developing new weapons. Rising sea level from the climate crisis threatens 128 US military bases on our coasts and spreads military pollution on these bases to coastal waters, coral reefs, and marine life, and also to groundwater under the bases, as well as on-base drinking water sources. The Pentagon sees climate change as a threat multiplier and is preparing to intervene around the world in climate crises on a continuum from rescue operations to threats to their own fighting capacity from sea level rise on their bases, to intervening in conflicts arising from resource wars and refugees, to war with Russia in the Arctic over oil and minerals. And I will say that the war with Russia in the Arctic is also moving towards an inevitable status, as war with China has. The Dakota Access Pipeline, oil and water at home. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe initiated nonviolent protests in 2016 to stop construction of a fracked crude oil pipeline leading to a terminal in Illinois. The pipeline was laid near a lake holding water diverted from the Missouri River, which is the tribe's drinking water source. Police used rubber bullets, mace, attack dogs, water cannons in freezing temperatures, tear gas, and concussion grenades against the nonviolent protesters. A medic treating injuries described the armed soldiers and police as waging a low-grade war. Remember that statistic that 1/4 to 1/2 of wars since 1973 have been fought over oil. We can consider this within that category. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are among the countries most threatened by climate crisis. They are primarily within the Central American Dry Corridor, and they are also the 3 countries from which the largest number of refugees comes to our southern border through Mexico. The US response under Trump was to militarize security at our border, including a border wall, armed military and border guards, and intense surveillance, as well as to provide aid to the 3 countries, that's Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, to militarize their borders against migration to the US. The military historian Victor Hansen characterizes the identity of the United States since its inception as manifest destiny, frontier mentality, rugged individualism, unfettered market capitalism, and muscular independence. Hansen's masculinist profile of US identity is embodied in the 2021 discretionary budget priorities as seen as this pie chart. Note that the Pentagon budget does not encompass other military-related agencies such as the CIA, the National Security Administration, the Veterans Administration, debt on US wars, etc. Thus, the full military budget allocation is significantly higher than 53% of our discretionary taxes. Meanwhile, education, health and human services, housing, labor, research and investment in renewable energy, transportation and infrastructure, and more receive crumbs from the master's table. In contrast to the mainstream US patriarchal history, with its roots in genocide of Native Americans, African American slavery, lack of rights for women, and ruthless capitalist exploitation of nature. We have a long people's history of resistance against oppression and war with vibrant peace activism. Activist movements on behalf of equal rights for women, Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and immigrants. Labor movements for unions, a living wage, and safe working conditions, as well as worker cooperatives. Environmental movements for the protection of air, water, soil, and biodiversity. And more recently, climate crisis and species extinction activism with remarkable youth activism. In 2018, we saw progressive wins, particularly in the House of Representatives and at local levels, with more progressive women voted into office. So, what is needed for peace, democracy, and saving the planet? And I hope that when this slide presentation is finished, that we could have more discussion on each of these that I have listed here. I will speak briefly about them, but I think further discussion is most definitely needed. So what is needed? I list sex equality. And why? The equality of women has been shown to be the major factor in a country's peace. This is using statistical analysis. That is, and by a country's peace, I mean its lack of civil conflict and lack of engagement in international conflict. There were more than 300 factors that were used, all aspects of the equality of women in society, to do this analysis. What else is needed for peace, democracy, and saving the planet? Racial and ethnic equality. Our current military conflict is solely in non-white countries or in countries where the identity of people is perceived to be non-white, such as Arab countries. And this has been the case almost exclusively since World War II. Another factor in peace, democracy, and saving our planet: income equality. Countries with higher income inequality also have higher disparity in illness, mental health, education, housing, community cohesion, and political influence. Again, and this has also been demonstrated statistically, countries with higher income inequality also have higher disparity in illness, mental health, education, housing, community cohesion, and political influence, thus undermining the true social security of citizens and also, crucially, political democracy. Another factor in peace, democracy, and saving the planet: Indigenous rights. And why? Studies have shown that when governments honor Indigenous land rights, the land and its resources and biodiversity have better stewardship. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.